You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with Good Question Podcast. I have Roger Finke. He's a distinguished professor of sociology and international affairs. He's also the co-director for the Association of Religious Data Archives. And that website is ARDA.com. We talk about the relationship that religion has with the state in which someone is located. So, Roger, thank you for coming.
Glad to be here.
And just quick thing for listeners, when I say state, I don't mean the state like in which state of the United States. I mean the state meaning the government in which someone is living under. So, clarification. But Roger, thank you for coming. If you would tell me a bit about your background and then about the work that you're doing today.
Last 20 years or so, I've been working in the area of religion and state relationships and looking at how governments either choose to regulate religions, support religions, or in some cases persecute religions. And then also looking within those countries how other social movements beyond the state have an impact on religious minorities and religious majority groups, and just overall relationships between religion and politics in general.
Well, I've seen, different countries persecuting different religions. I mean, what have you seen, I guess, as an overview? Has it been ramping up? Has it been changing the nature of how it works? What does it look like today in 2022 at the end?
Right. Over the 20 years that I've been doing this, and really the data collections have gone back farther than that, but there's been a clear increase in overall restrictions placed on all religions, but in particular religious minorities. And at the very same time, the vast majority of constitutions, about 90% of all constitutions, have some guarantee of religious freedom. At the very time, they're passing laws that deny certain freedoms or place restrictions on religious groups. And probably one of the most frequent ways that states do that is it's not so much the very noticeable persecution where they are imprisoned or followers in some way are tortured. The more common way is simply registration requirements that make it very difficult for the religious institutions to exist.
How much of this happens in the U.S. versus other countries? Like, what can you say about that?
In the U.S., since 1990, there was a landmark case, Smith versus Oregon, which really changed how the freedoms granted to religion. And it's been a source of controversy ever since. Prior to that time, the state had to have compelling interests as far as to deny someone religious freedom. Smith versus Oregon case, it was ruled that if a law is formally neutral and generally applicable, that it could deny such freedoms. And then that's been fought in a series of religious restoration acts on states all across the country. But in addition to that, there's been a lot of turmoil over how religious freedoms relate to other civil rights, as well as what the relationship, again, between religion and state should be with the rise of Christian nationalism recently.
I would say also, too, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but, the whole COVID situation and getting religious exemptions for, the big V, it seems like religion is playing a vital, important role there if people want to use that. I don't know if you want to comment on it or not. It's up to you. But.
Well, yeah, no, this is where a lot of court cases are hitting on right now is what is the boundary for religious freedoms? To what extent can you say this is my religious freedom or this is an inherent part of my life in this religion? And that's the one that the courts have been struggling with really ever since the founding of the nation. But I think in the last 20 years, it's become even much sharper in division lines forming.
So what are you trying to figure out in your study of this interaction between the state and people's religions? You look back over history, you're cataloging what's been happening. What are some of the questions that come to your mind?
Some of the questions are, the initial questions posed were, what are the reactions to, or what are the consequences, if you will, of states either supporting religion or restricting religion? What are the consequences for overall involvement in religion? And one of the more powerful effects we found was that when there's the states often view that they need to restrict religions or regulate religions in an attempt to reduce social conflict. And what we find is quite the opposite occurs, that overall levels of religious persecution, They increase as you have more and more restrictions on different religions, in particular minority religions. So one of the first things we just wondered was, what are the consequences of these restrictions? And what impact do they have on the society as a whole? What impact do they have on the minorities which are being persecuted? So that was one of the initial questions, but we also ask a lot of questions about how does religious freedoms arise, or how does the support for state support for a select religion arise? Because on each extreme, we can see as far as more conflict occurring when only one religion is supported and supported heavily by the state and all other religions are discriminated against, or when the religion or when the state tries to be completely secular society and tries to hold down all religions. Both extremes, you can see more restrictions on the religious minorities.
Yeah, what are the dynamics of those two things? So, I mean, I don't know for sure, but from what I've heard, in India, there's what's called Hindu nationalism. So Muslims are being persecuted more, it seems like. I don't know about Christians. But what is the difference between what happens in a state that does that versus a state that just says no religion at all? That's it. Everything's going secular.
Yeah, well, I think I'll first deal with the India question and then with the secular state question. But in India, that offers a perfect example of high levels of social restrictions, where officially the government tries to be neutral on religion, or at least was before the most recent administration. You have a lot of social movements really grounded in religious beliefs that are very strongly discriminatory against other religions. The tensions against Muslims is the most visible and probably the most violent. But at the same time, Pentecostal Christians in particular and other minority religions that are very vocal about their faith face an extreme amount of persecution from some of the movements that will actually even enter into their worship services, will try to get them arrested, or will result in some sort of physical persecution against the people. So that's more of an example of where it's not as much the state being the direct driving force as it is social movements within the larger culture. And they do try to influence the state as well. But much of the pressure is coming from these other social movements, religious movements side of the state.
Does the state set the tone in that case? Or is it does it look like it's these individual religions, but it's really the state kind of behind the scenes, like setting the background for it? Or what do you think?
Yeah, with the most recent administration, that certainly is the concern. And then even before the most recent administration, local authorities would often turn a blind eye to things that are occurring. So in a couple examples, the local state officials were transferred when they wanted to heavily enforce, the protection of certain religious minorities, because they would turn a blind eye to some of these things that are occurring. So it is something that's certainly driven by social movements, but quite often the state does turn a blind eye to some of the things occurring. And your other question on the secular state, there really is two different types of, or it's often divided into at least two different types of secular states. The one secular state which tries to take religion out of the public arena, if you will, to reduce religion's role. So it's greatly limited in terms of what its institutions can do, to what extent it can be included in conversations politically in schools and a variety of other areas that way. But there's others that try to have a secular state which has no interference by religion, but at the same time, they try to have a high level of protection for the religious groups in the state. So there's very different forms of secular states. Some, it's simply a separation of religion and state, but it's still a strong enforcement of trying to protect religious freedoms. In others, it's one where it's really an effort to push religion out of the public arena and push religious institutions, greatly limit their activities, which in turn, affects overall levels of involvement in religion.
Okay. So what are you working on in particular right now? You have an understanding, obviously, what's going on, it sounds like, with these different dynamics, but are there particular cases or states right now that you're focused on understanding the dynamic, or what's your work about today?
More of my work now is working with global data sets. Jonathan Fox has collected data from the Religion and State Project. The Pew Research Center has collected indicators by countries around the globe. So using some of those data and combining them with other sorts of social conflict, again, to understand as far as the relationship it holds for social conflict or tensions within those countries. Some of the questions that I think still need to be addressed would be, does democracy foster increased religious freedom? For a long time, we sort of assume that it's democracy synonymous with increased freedoms, all sorts of civil liberties. There's, we have to look at that closely. For example, does open and free elections always enforce or improve civil liberties? And there's a lot of questions there because the majority rule is the very thing that de Tocqueville and many early authors were concerned about. Was if you have majority rule, then the majority will do fine and find things in agreement with what they want, but the minorities will face a lot of restrictions. So there's a lot of series of questions, and I think the relationship between religious freedom and other civil liberties is another interesting question that just starting to address. Religious freedoms are quite different than, even though they're closely overlapped with other civil liberties, there's still a lot of tension between them. So on the one hand, the freedom, like this, with the UN promises of freedom to express your religion, freedom to practice your religion, really overlaps with freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So on one hand, they're very closely overlapped, but on the other hand, you see high levels of tension between religion and some gender roles and gender rights, women's rights. You see some tension certainly between in areas of same-sex marriage and religion. So the whole relationship between civil liberties and religious freedoms is one area of potential tension and an area that I think needs to be better understood as well.
So what are some of the big questions that are on your mind that you're trying to figure out at this moment with your research and your work?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I mean, I'm trying to retire, so, but at the same time, some of the things that I think need to be addressed more, and some of my research that I'll be finishing up will hopefully try to, is simply how does the freedom of institutions influence the freedoms of individuals? If you look at the UN, other cases, you see that almost all the rights or the guarantees are for individuals. Most discrimination and most restrictions are placed on the institutions. And in that case, religion is very different than many other civil rights because the people tend to be organized into movements and in local institutions, whether they're congregations of some sort. So understanding the relationship between how states treat those institutions and their individual freedoms is, I think, an interesting and important question. And that's also an interesting one for trying to understand the social conflict which might occur from changes in levels of freedom of religion and how these religions mobilize themselves.
What about the decision makers that are in the legislature, in a particular government, or the governing people too, the president, the prime minister, et cetera? If they're secular, is there any training for them to let them know, hey, religious type issues will come up and this is the suggestion how you handle them? Or if they're of a faith that is different from the majority or a faith that is different from the one that they're either legislating for or against, is there any, again, training? Is that even the right word for it? But how can you make decision makers aware of these before they get into power, let's say, so that they don't make decisions that, screw people over?
Right. Yeah. I'm not aware of any training, to be honest, but I think one of the most basic ones is that there's always a tendency that when there's a potential problem is to regulate it heavily. So and there's different motivations for why religion should be regulated. Some it's because a legislator is a member of a majority religion and they want to regulate against these minorities. A second one is simply that they want freedom from religion and they want to regulate religious minorities in all religions. But it's like so many rights as far as if you recognize that your freedoms are other people's, it results actually in much less tension. And that's one thing that's proven true as far as the extent that these freedoms are practiced more openly, there tends to be less conflict around them. To the extent that there's attempts to try to restrict certain religions, regulate them, or provide a lot of support for one religion but not another religion, you tend to have much more conflict evolving around religion. So, I mean, the real basic point is regulation of these groups is not the answer, and certainly trying to show favoritism towards only one religion is not the answer. Really trying to open it up for all religions, so it's a neutral playing ground, if you will, that tends to reduce the tensions.
Any examples of this process done right? I'm sure this process done wrong is probably easy to find too, but maybe one of each.
Yeah. Boy. I mean, I think if you take, the early United States is one that really surprised all sorts of places. Our European colleagues, when they would visit, such as de Tocqueville in the early 19th century, he was amazed at how all of these religions could live peacefully, because the right of one was also the right of the other one. And so that was something where, and he also felt that it was even essential for the democracy. There was this common respect for each other in that area. So, I mean, I think that was an example of where it really took off in the right direction in the 19th and early 20th century for the U.S. and especially with so many immigrants coming in, because now we think of them all as being Christian immigrants, but at the time, Catholic immigrants were viewed as highly dangerous by many Protestant groups. So the fact that they had to respect their rights was really it was a major leap of faith, I guess you could say. And in terms of where it goes wrong, I think you can, there's be a lot of tensions, where this has occurred. I mean, obviously in India, you can see where the social restrictions that have gotten out of hand quite often, because the state has turned a blind eye. That certainly has caused a lot of open conflict, social conflict. I think, you could take examples. Let me think of a good one here. Even someone, as an example where, such as Russia, this was opened up. You saw this sort of flowering of all these religions, because suddenly you had this freedom of religion for all groups. And then you see all of a sudden a clamping down on these groups. And now there's much more tension surrounding religion in the Soviet Union than there was before, when it was actually opening up. But I think there's a variety of Muslim majority countries where you could also use examples. Examples where it doesn't work well is much longer.
Well, when one religion is favored over another, does that lead to a climate where eventually the main one also gets persecuted or sidelined, or does that not happen?
Yeah, I think it depends on how its relationship with the state as a whole. You can take something like the Soviet Union, where the Orthodox Church is the church which is receiving favorable rights in many, many ways. Yet at the same time, it really has no authority over the state at all. So it faces open persecution, such as the priests and bishops that spoke out against the Ukrainian war. Many of them have gotten into trouble with the government over their stance, so they don't have the freedom to speak out. So, yeah.
No, I just wonder, again, how there's that old saying, they came for XYZ and I wasn't XYZ, so I didn't do anything. And then they came for ABC, and eventually they came for me, and no one was left to defend me. I wonder if that happens with this kind of policy. Like, once it gets in place and let's say a religious minority starts being persecuted or marginalized, does that seem to inevitably lead to all of them going that way?
Well, I think, yes. No, I think it's an important point is, quite often when any minority, but especially when talk about religious minorities now, initially when they're persecuted against, it seems far removed from most other religious groups. It seems far removed from most other social groups. However, to the extent that the policies that are implemented against that religious group will also in the long run have an effect on other religious groups too. And as I mentioned before, even some of the civil rights for religious groups or institutions overlap with the civil rights for other institutions, social institutions, such as the freedom to assemble, the freedom of speech, freedom to believe. So yeah, once certain discrimination or regulation restrictions start being placed on one group, it often almost always has an impact on other groups around it. And you also see this when there is one group which provokes violence. So, for example, when there was dropping the name of the group, but it was a cult in France as far as in the 1990s. And when they committed suicide, there was a mass suicide group, and all of a sudden it resulted in when there was this mass, then all of a sudden you see restrictions arising on many other groups. Suddenly the guest commission, was assembled to address it, found 173 dangerous sects and cults, which included Hasidic Jews, Baptists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, a whole long line of group that had nothing to do with this cult. But as far as when the restrictions are placed on one, suddenly it's simply out and has a far-reaching effect.
Have you seen any efforts that, how do these things stop? How do these things reverse? If you have a country that, again, suppresses religion or persecutes certain groups, when does it end? How does it end? What could we learn from when it's reversed course and gotten better?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of some quick examples on that.
Hopefully there are some. No, I'm sure there are some. But
I'm sure there are some too. Yeah, no, I think, clearly when legislation is passed as far as, trying to open up, to reduce the restrictions between, it's often ethnicity and religion overlap. And so when there's attempts to try to reduce that and increase the freedoms of both sides, that certainly tends to reduce the conflict between the two. And certainly there have been examples. I'm drawing a shortage right now, but certainly there have been, I even take the Russian example I gave before. When it first occurred and there was an opening up of these religious groups, there was much less tension between many of the religious groups and even between some of the local institutions when there were greater freedoms for all the groups. So even that was a very short-lived example of how it did open up very quickly.
I don't know. Is there particular legislation that you've seen examples of that really was good for, allowing religious groups to flourish and not be persecuted? Is there any good examples of legislation, again, that can be pointed out to another country that's going down the wrong road or area?
I think one of the most common ones would be registration requirements. Many states now, or countries, will have restrictions on who can register as a religion. And if you're not registered, you quite often can't have bank accounts, own property. There's a whole level of restrictions that you might have if you can't register. But those registration requirements can be anything from you must exist for 15 years, or you must have a certain size following, you must believe certain things, or you must be willing to teach pro-communist classes such as in China, So there's a long list of different things that way. So I think one of the things that really benefits all the groups is when there's really just equal ground for all to participate, and that restrictions for them is greatly reduced.
So I know you're going to be retiring somewhat soon, but what do you want, let's say, I don't know, the legacy of the work you're doing to be going forward? How is it going to instruct future people that are studying this to help resolve these conflicts when they arise?
Right. Well, I think a couple of ways I hope there's a lasting effect is one, at the Association of Religion Data Archives, the archive I run, we were one of the first to start collecting data in this area. So we simply document as far as which countries have freedom of religion clauses, which countries have high levels of religious conflict, which countries have high levels of state favoritism of religion, and which ones have high levels of religious freedom. So just collecting that data and continuing to have some sort of data collection in the area, I think is important for the future. Right now, the Religion and State Project in Bar-Ilan, Israel is one which continues to collect data in that area. The Pew Research Center in D.C. is another that continues to collect data in that area. I think a second area is simply opening up some of and by the way, those data collections too allow to show changes over time and trends over time. And that's where you get to see how there's been an increase in some of these restrictions on religions or increased requirements on registration. So I think just having those data in place help to inform the public, governments, others as far as what's occurring there. The other part that I hope have influence is simply that showing the benefits, opening up freedoms for all religions, not simply select religions, or not trying to persecute all religions, which occurs in a handful of countries right now, but really opening it up for all religions and the benefits it has on reducing persecution and discrimination against those minority religions, but also benefiting all religions that indirectly they are beneficiaries of it as well too.
Yeah, maybe it's a stupid question, but why do restrictions result in violence against a particular community? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is in the Christian nationalism case, the case we talked about from India, and you certainly see some not Christian nationalism, the religious nationalism movement, Hindu nationalism movement you see in India. Even in the Christian nationalist movement you see in the U.S., sometimes they target and are very anti certain minority religions. They might be religions that to them represent some sort of immigrant or foreign influence, or it might be simply a religious competitor that they want to see get rid of it. So that often results in open conflict. Sometimes religions are closely tied to a certain ethnic group. So you have tensions occurring between different ethnic groups that might have different social classes and also are tied in with religion, which then the two become conflicts result from that as well. And I think a third one, which is a growing number of cases, especially in developed countries, is you have a more militant secularism, which is trying to reduce as far as the religious groups And those religious groups then in turn responded in some very strong ways. And really, it's gone both ways. Even in India, as an example, there have been the Communist Party, which has been involved in some of the conflicts as well, too. So there's a whole lot of reasons as far as that this and what gets involved this way. And again, to remember, religion is often organized around institutions. And those institutions can often effectively mobilize people in very good ways or in negative ways. And that's something that you always need to be aware of.
Okay. Well, very good. Roger, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and to maybe query the data or see the data that you've collected? Where can they go?
Yeah. As far as looking at the data, if they want to go to thearda.com, so thearda.com, they can both look at the data on religion-state relationships, but they can also look at trends in overall religion over time by country. And there's a host of other information they can find out by country as well. So I think that's one of the best ones to do some exploration by themselves on this. In terms of, I do have a book, Freedom Denied. I have a lot of different research articles, which can be easily found as well too. But I think The Price of Freedom Denied is the one that's probably the easiest to get through Amazon or other sources.
Oh, you said it's The Price of Freedom?
It's called The Price of Freedom Denied, and it's with Cambridge University Press. Also, my colleague Jonathan Fox is another one who's written several books in this area. And Dan Philpott from Notre Dame has written some books in this area as well.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Roger, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.